The city hummed with life just beyond the tall windows of Le Maison Rouge, an upscale French restaurant nestled in the heart of downtown. Chandeliers sparkled from the ceiling, their golden light reflecting off polished wine glasses and the sleek marble floor. Soft classical music played in the background, blending seamlessly with the murmurs of well-dressed patrons engaged in quiet conversation. Waiters in crisp white shirts and black vests moved efficiently between tables, balancing silver trays topped with delicate hors d'oeuvres and bottles of expensive wine. Among the patrons was Mr. Donovan, a distinguished businessman in his early 50s. He sat at a corner table, dressed in a tailored navy suit, his Rolex catching the light as he swirled a glass of deep red Bordeaux. He was a man of quiet authority, his name well known in corporate circles, yet he carried himself with the kind of understated confidence that made people pay attention. He had seen great success, but unlike many of his peers, he hadn't forgotten what it was like to struggle. At that moment, the glass doors of the restaurant swung open, drawing a few disapproving glances from the diners. A man stood hesitantly at the entrance, a stark contrast to the refined guests. Charlie, his hair unkempt and his clothes tattered, stepped inside, gripping his threadbare coat around himself. His face, lined with exhaustion, bore the unmistakable signs of hardship. He wasn't there to beg, nor to cause a scene. He was simply hungry, the gnawing emptiness in his stomach growing unbearable. The warmth of the restaurant enveloped him, a stark contrast to the cold outside. The aroma of freshly baked bread and seared steak filled his senses, making his hunger even more acute. He took a tentative step forward, his worn-out sneakers squeaking against the polished floor. Conversations began to falter. A few patrons exchanged uncomfortable glances, others pretended not to notice. The maitre d', a man in his mid-40s with a thin mustache, stiffened at the sight of Charlie. Jason, a young waiter standing nearby, narrowed his eyes and stepped forward before the maitre d' could intervene. Charlie approached the nearest empty table, placing his calloused hands on the back of a chair. He cleared his throat and spoke in a voice that was quiet yet firm. "Excuse me, sir," he said, addressing Jason. "I was wondering if I could see a menu. I have some money, I just need a meal." Jason's lips curled in distaste as he looked Charlie up and down. A hush settled over the restaurant. All eyes were on them now. "This isn't the place for you," Jason said, his tone laced with condescension. "We have standards here." Charlie's expression faltered for a moment, but he held his ground. "I can pay," he insisted. Jason scoffed, stepping in front of the table as if to physically block Charlie from sitting. "It's not about the money," he said coldly. "It's about the kind of customers we serve." From his corner of the restaurant, Mr. Donovan set down his glass of wine and leaned forward, watching the exchange with quiet interest. He had seen enough. Charlie stood his ground, his fingers tightening around the back of the chair. The soft murmurs of conversation that had once filled the restaurant had quieted, replaced by the weight of silent judgment. He could feel the eyes of the diners on him, some filled with curiosity, others with quiet disdain. "I can pay," he repeated, his voice steady but carrying a hint of desperation. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a few crumpled bills, smoothing them out with his rough, calloused hands. "I just need a meal." Jason let out a sharp breath, his irritation barely concealed. He crossed his arms and gave Charlie a disdainful look, his polished shoes tapping impatiently against the marble floor. "This isn't a soup kitchen," Jason said, his voice dripping with condescension. "We have an image to maintain. If we start serving people like you, what do you think will happen to this place?" Charlie felt his stomach tighten, not just from hunger, but from the shame creeping in. He had expected some resistance, but he hadn't expected to be treated like an inconvenience, as if his mere presence tainted the restaurant. A woman at a nearby table wrinkled her nose and whispered something to her companion, who nodded in agreement. An older gentleman in a crisp tuxedo shot Charlie a disapproving glance before turning his attention back to his wine. The maitre d' stood by the front desk, watching the interaction with carefully restrained disinterest. Jason sighed dramatically, as if the situation itself was beneath him. "I'll have to ask you to leave," he said, taking a step closer, his voice quieter but no less cruel. "Now." Charlie hesitated. He had been turned away before, but this time it felt different. This time he had walked in not as a beggar, but as a paying customer, even if his pockets carried only a fraction of what these people spent on a single bottle of wine. Before he could decide whether to turn away or stand his ground, a calm yet authoritative voice cut through the tension. "That won't be necessary." Jason stiffened, his expression shifting as he turned toward the source of the voice. Mr. Donovan set his wineglass down and pushed back his chair. He stood slowly, straightening the cuffs of his tailored suit before making his way toward the scene. There was an air of quiet power in the way he moved, controlled, deliberate. The other diners watched with interest, sensing a shift in the dynamic. Jason forced a polite smile, though his posture remained rigid. "Mr. Donovan, sir," he said, quickly adopting a more deferential tone. "I apologize for the disturbance. I was just—" Mr. Donovan held up a hand, cutting him off mid-sentence. He turned to Charlie, his sharp eyes scanning the man before him, not with disgust, but with curiosity. "What's your name?" Mr. Donovan asked. Charlie hesitated for only a moment before answering. "Charlie, sir." Mr. Donovan nodded. "And you said you wanted a meal?" Charlie straightened his shoulders. "Yes, sir, if that's not too much trouble." Mr. Donovan turned his gaze back to Jason, his expression unreadable. "Then I believe we should get him one." Jason's mouth opened slightly, as if about to argue, but no words came out. The weight of authority in Mr. Donovan's voice left no room for debate. The restaurant, once filled with hushed whispers of judgment, was now consumed by an even deeper silence. Jason forced a tight-lipped smile, shifting his weight uncomfortably. The eyes of the restaurant were on him, but none more piercing than Mr. Donovan's. The wealthy businessman stood tall, his sharp gaze unwavering as he gestured toward Charlie. "Tell me, Jason," Mr. Donovan said, his voice calm yet firm. "Why exactly are you refusing to serve this man?" Jason glanced around as if searching for support among the patrons, but found only curious and expectant faces. He cleared his throat and adjusted his vest. "Sir, it's just that—" He hesitated before lowering his voice, as though embarrassed to explain. "We have a certain standard here at La Maison Rouge. This gentleman—" Jason cast an insincere glance at Charlie. "Doesn't exactly fit the image we try to uphold." Mr. Donovan raised an eyebrow. "And what image is that?" Jason faltered. "You know, the kind of clientele we serve." He leaned in slightly. "With all due respect, sir, he's just a beggar. He probably doesn't have enough to pay for a glass of water, let alone a meal." The words cut through the air like a cold blade. Charlie flinched slightly but held his ground. He had heard it all before. He knew how the world saw him. Mr. Donovan, however, did not flinch. Instead, a small smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth, as though he had expected this response. He exhaled slowly, then reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. With deliberate care, he pulled out a sleek black leather wallet and flipped it open. "I see," he said, retrieving a crisp $100 bill and placing it on the table between them. "So the issue isn't that you refuse to serve him, it's that you assume he can't pay." Jason's face turned slightly red. "Well, sir, I just—" Mr. Donovan held up a hand, silencing him effortlessly. "Then let me remove that concern for you." He retrieved another bill, then another, laying them down neatly beside the first. Gasps rippled through the restaurant as more bills joined the pile. "This should cover his meal, don't you think?" Jason's lips pressed into a thin line. He had no choice but to nod. "Good," Mr. Donovan continued, his tone never rising, but holding the kind of authority that made it clear he was not to be questioned. "Now, I want you to bring him the best meal this restaurant has to offer, whatever the chef considers his finest dish, and make sure it's served with the same respect and attention as any other guest here." Jason hesitated, his jaw tight, but he nodded stiffly. "Of course, sir." The tension in the air was thick as Jason turned on his heel and strode toward the kitchen, his posture rigid with resentment. The room was silent. Charlie stood there, stunned. His hands trembled slightly as he looked at Mr. Donovan. "You didn't have to do that," he murmured. Mr. Donovan smiled, placing a reassuring hand on Charlie's shoulder. "Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity," he said simply. Across the restaurant, the whispers started again, but this time they carried a different tone. Instead of judgment, there was intrigue, and perhaps a touch of shame. The tension in the restaurant slowly eased as Jason reluctantly set down a steaming plate in front of Charlie. The dish, a beautifully plated filet mignon with roasted vegetables and a side of creamy mashed potatoes, was a stark contrast to the cold sandwiches and scraps Charlie had been surviving on. He hesitated for a moment, almost unable to believe that this was truly for him. "Go on," Mr. Donovan encouraged, taking his seat across from Charlie. His voice was warm, absent of pity. "Enjoy your meal." Charlie swallowed hard before picking up the silverware. He cut into the steak carefully, savoring the aroma before taking his first bite. The flavors burst in his mouth, rich and tender in a way he hadn't experienced in years. For the first time in a long while, he felt human again. As he ate, Mr. Donovan leaned forward slightly. "Charlie," he said, "tell me your story." Charlie wiped his mouth with a napkin, glancing around at the restaurant. Some diners had returned to their meals, but many still watched, their expressions shifting from curiosity to quiet reflection. He let out a small sigh before answering. "I wasn't always like this," he began, his voice steady but laced with pain. "I had a job, a good one too. Worked in construction, wasn't fancy, but it paid the bills." He paused, his fingers tightening around the fork. "I had a wife, a little girl." He smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "They were my world." Mr. Donovan remained silent, listening intently. "Then the accident happened," Charlie continued. "A bad fall on site. Broke my leg in 3 places. Couldn't work for months. Bills piled up. My wife tried to hold everything together, but..." He exhaled shakily. "She got sick, real sick. I tried everything. Sold what I could, begged for work, but it wasn't enough. She passed away." A heavy silence settled between them. Even the waitstaff, who had been trying to act indifferent, seemed to be listening now. Charlie took a deep breath before finishing. "After that, I just lost my way. Lost my home. Lost everything." He looked down at his now empty plate, as if ashamed. "People stopped seeing me as a person, just another homeless guy on the street." Mr. Donovan's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes softened. He reached for his wineglass, swirling the liquid absently. "I know what it's like to struggle," he said after a moment. "I wasn't always wealthy. Grew up in a poor neighborhood. My parents worked themselves to the bone, but some nights we still went hungry. I know how quickly life can turn." He leaned forward, his gaze steady. "The difference is, someone gave me a chance." Charlie met his eyes, surprised. "You needed someone to believe in you," Mr. Donovan continued. "I had that, and now maybe I can be that person for you." A murmur ran through the restaurant. The wealthy patrons who had initially looked down on Charlie now sat in silence, their faces a mix of guilt and self-awareness. For the first time, they saw him not as an outsider, but as a man with a story, one that could have just as easily been theirs. Charlie set his fork down gently, exhaling as the last traces of his meal settled in his stomach. It was the best food he'd had in years, not just because of the quality, but because, for once, he hadn't felt like an outsider, like someone undeserving of kindness. He wiped his mouth with the linen napkin and looked across the table at Mr. Donovan, who sipped his wine with a thoughtful expression. The weight of everything that had happened in the past hour settled over Charlie, and he struggled to find the right words. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not just for the meal, but for treating me like a person." Mr. Donovan set his glass down, studying Charlie for a long moment before speaking. "You don't owe me thanks, Charlie. Everyone deserves dignity." He straightened in his seat. "But I'm not done yet." Charlie blinked. "Sir?" The restaurant had mostly quieted again, but ears were still turned toward their table, subtle glances stealing toward them as the other diners pretended not to eavesdrop. Mr. Donovan laced his fingers together on the table. "I own a few companies, Charlie," he said casually, as if speaking of the weather. "One of them specializes in construction and renovation. We're always looking for hard workers. And something tells me you've never been afraid of hard work." Charlie stiffened, barely able to process what he was hearing. Mr. Donovan smiled. "I'm offering you a job, a fresh start." A few gasps rippled through the restaurant, and even Jason, who had been lurking near the kitchen, paled slightly. Charlie opened his mouth, then closed it, his throat tightening. You're serious?" "Dead serious." Mr. Donovan's tone was firm, leaving no room for doubt. "You were dealt a bad hand, but that doesn't mean the game's over. If you're willing to work, I'm willing to give you the chance." Charlie swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the edge of the table. A mix of emotions swirled inside him: gratitude, disbelief, and something he hadn't felt in years: hope. He exhaled, shaking his head. Charlie sat back in his chair, exhaling slowly as he placed his silverware down. The warmth of the meal filled his stomach, but more than that, something else settled inside him, a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in years. He wiped his mouth with the napkin, glancing up at Mr. Donovan, who watched him with an expression of quiet satisfaction. Charlie swallowed, his throat tight with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you," he said sincerely. "Not just for the meal, but for seeing me, for treating me like a person." Mr. Donovan gave a small nod, but instead of responding immediately, he tapped his fingers on the table, considering something. Then, with a small smile, he leaned forward. "Tell me something, Charlie," he said. "If you had the chance to start over, would you take it?" Charlie frowned slightly, caught off guard. Of course," he said. He shook his head. "People don't get second chances like that." Mr. Donovan chuckled. "Maybe most don't, but I believe in paying it forward." He reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a sleek business card, sliding it across the table toward Charlie. "I own several companies. One of them specializes in construction and renovations. We're always looking for hard workers." A hush fell over the restaurant. The murmurs that had been circling among the patrons now ceased entirely as everyone strained to hear what was unfolding. Even Jason, the waiter, stood frozen a few feet away, his face pale with realization. Charlie stared at the card as if it might disappear. His hands trembled as he picked it up. "You're offering me a job?" Mr. Donovan nodded. "A fresh start." For the first time in a long time, Charlie felt something stir in his chest. Hope. His lips parted, but no words came out at first. He had been beaten down for so long, told he wasn't worth anything, that this almost felt like a dream. I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Mr. Donovan said simply. Charlie swallowed hard, his vision blurring slightly. He closed his fist around the business card and nodded firmly. "Yes," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion welling up inside him. "Yes, I'd be honored." A quiet ripple of shock moved through the restaurant. The same people who had turned their noses up at him earlier now sat in silence, confronted with the reality of their own judgments. Jason, the waiter, took a step forward, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Sir, He turned to Charlie, shame flickering in his eyes. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have treated you like that." Charlie looked at him for a long moment before offering a small nod. "We all make mistakes," he said. "It's what we do after them that matters." Mr. Donovan smiled at that. As Charlie stood to leave, something inside him felt lighter. He had walked into La Maison Rouge as a man at his lowest point, unseen and discarded by society. Now he was walking out with a second chance, a future. And as the restaurant's patrons watched him leave, they weren't just left with an evening of fine dining. They were left with something far more valuable, a lesson in humility, in kindness, and in the power of giving someone a chance when no one else would. The soft hum of conversation and the clinking of fine china filled La Maison Rouge, just as it always had. The chandeliers still glowed with golden light, and the air carried the scent of freshly baked bread and fine wine. The restaurant remained a haven for the wealthy, a place where status was everything. But tonight, something was different. As the doors swung open, a man stepped inside, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. He was clean-shaven, his dark hair neatly combed, and his well-fitted suit, though not extravagant, carried an air of quiet confidence. He walked with purpose, his back straight, his shoulders no longer weighed down by exhaustion. Charlie. He took a deep breath as he scanned the room, memories of that fateful night flooding back. The whispers, the judgmental stares, the sting of being turned away. But today, no one looked at him with disdain. If anything, the few who did recognize him now regarded him with quiet awe. From across the room, Jason was gathering plates from a table when he glanced up, and froze. His eyes widened as recognition dawned, his grip on the tray tightening. The last time he had seen Charlie, he had been a homeless man begging for a chance to eat. Now, he stood tall, dressed in sharp business attire, no longer a man struggling to survive, but one who had reclaimed his dignity. Charlie walked toward him, and Jason quickly placed the tray down, swallowing hard. He wiped his hands on his apron, his heart pounding. "Charlie," he murmured, unsure of what to say. Charlie stopped in front of him, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. Jason opened his mouth to speak, to apologize again, to explain, but before he could, Charlie gave him a small, knowing smile. "I see you're still here," Charlie said, his voice even but not unkind. Jason nodded, his face burning with shame. "Yeah, I am." He hesitated before continuing. "Listen, what I did to you that night, I was wrong, and I've regretted it ever since." He glanced around the restaurant, then back at Charlie. "You didn't deserve that." Charlie studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I appreciate that." He could have humiliated Jason, made him feel as small as he once had, but that wasn't who he was. That wasn't the lesson he had learned. Jason shifted awkwardly. "So, what brings you back?" Charlie reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek business card, one that now had his name on it. "Business dinner," he said with a chuckle. "Mr. Donovan brought me on as a project manager." Jason's eyebrows shot up. "Wow, that's amazing." Charlie nodded, slipping the card back into his pocket. "Yeah, turns out a second chance can change everything." Jason exhaled, nodding slowly. "I guess it can." As Charlie walked toward a reserved table, the weight of the past fully behind him, the restaurant's patrons, many of whom had been there that night, watched in quiet contemplation. Tonight, they weren't just witnessing a man return. They were witnessing proof that kindness, when given at the right moment, had the power to change a life forever.